Welcome. My name is Tim Ferlin. I'm the editor of the upcoming issue of the Harvard Journal of Bioethics, and I'm delighted to welcome Professor Glenn Cohen with us today to do this spotlight interview and to talk about all of the important and fascinating work that you're doing. So Professor Glenn Cohen is the James A. Atwood and Leslie Williams Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. He is also the director of the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law, Biotechnology, and Bioethics. He is one of the world's leading experts on the intersection of law, medicine, healthcare, and bioethics. He has published more than 60 articles and chapters in a wide range of medical journals and top law reviews, including the New England Journal of Medicine and JAMA. He is the author of a major study here of medical tourism called Patients with Passports that we will be discussing, and we're delighted to welcome you here today, Glenn.
Thank you for having me.
So the first question I thought we might talk about is just a bit about your personal background, and were there initial topics or themes or questions that really intrigued you or fascinated you, that really caught your eye and led you to the study of bioethics?
Great. So yeah, I grew up in Canada, and I like to say Canadians are just obsessed with healthcare, so I was no exception. And when I was younger, I was kind of torn between doing a medical degree, doing a philosophy PhD, and doing a law degree. Pretty quickly ruled out the medical degree because I was intimidated by organic chemistry. Maybe if I had stuck with it, my life would have been different. And then I was really torn between doing the PhD and the JD. I decided to do the law degree first. I could always do the PhD in philosophy later. And it turns out later never came. But I've been able to spend a lot of time with people, including people here at the medical school. Dan Brock, who's now retired, Norm Daniels, the public health school, who've taught me great amounts of bioethics from a more philosophical perspective. And as an undergraduate at the University of Toronto, I had a degree in philosophy and psychology, and the philosophy part was heavily bioethics. So that's kind of how I entered the field. I practiced as a real lawyer for a while. I like to say I eliminated various kinds of lives I might have lived. When I came to law school, I thought I wanted to do international criminal law, so I worked doing genocide prosecutions for the Rwanda Tribunal. Decided that wasn't for me. Tried private law, worked for the Justice Department for a few years, which I loved, but the true calling I found was, for me, the academic study of law. And in terms of the topics I'm interested in, it really kind of varies. I love the new. I'm a lover of the new. My colleagues who spend their years studying constitutional law or history, I have great admiration for them, but it's just not the way my mind works. So one of the great things about my field is constantly new things are being injected, whether it's AI and medicine or reproductive technologies or medical tourism. I love writing about that, which is really the focus at the moment, while thinking about analogies to what's past.
Okay, wonderful. That segues right into several of the topics we're going to talk about. So obviously in 2015 you published this major study of medical tourism. It's a comprehensive legal and medical and ethical analysis of a number of topics. And I thought earlier you published an article called The View from 10,000 Feet of Medical Tourism. I was wondering if you could perhaps give us that view from 10,000 feet of the most significant legal and ethical issues raised by the practice of medical tourism today.
Great, yeah. So I tend to divide medical tourism into three parts. There's many ways of dividing it, but let's just start with three. One is to say medical tourism. Some people prefer the term medical travel because they think the tourism part sounds pejorative, although there's a lot of accuracy because often it's actually marketed as tourism. But one part is people who are traveling for healthcare goods and services that are legal at home and legal where they're going. And those people are mostly either shopping for price, it's expensive at home, it's cheaper somewhere else, shopping for expertise, or in some instances shopping because an insurer, for example, in the United States, has given them an incentive to go abroad. So that's like cardiac bypass, cosmetic surgery, and the like. Then there is medical tourism or medical travel for services that are illegal at home, but legal in the destination country, which I call circumvention tourism. So here we have people traveling for surrogacy, for example, for assisted suicide to Zurich, some stem cell treatments to China, for example. And the third bundle are people who are traveling for things that are both illegal where they are coming from and illegal where they are going to, but the laws are being enforced in a much more gentle way abroad. So the best example here is kidney tourism and transplant tourism in general. And here you have people traveling from the United States, the UK, South Africa, where have you, to places like Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, and Egypt to purchase kidneys. And sometimes it's a little bit more complicated because the person who is selling the kidney might come from one place and the transplant might happen somewhere else. So that's kind of the big overview from the 10,000 feet level of the trade. Now, in terms of ethical and legal issues, one set of issues is just the quality of care and whether people know about it. One set is about the transmission of multi-drug resistant bacteria, but in general, compromising one's health and the like through the travel. Also the continuity of care and whether physicians at home have an obligation to accept these kinds of patients. A different kind of issue that arises has to do with liability and medical malpractice in particular, and whether you can recover when something goes wrong. That's all about the legal stuff. When you talk about the stuff that is illegal at home, the circumvention tourism, for example, there's questions about the extraterritorial application of domestic law, about whether we think it's fair for people to have options outside of their home country, or whether you think a home country ought to extend this law to abroad, questions about exploitation. And then when you talk about the kidney transplant kind of trade and the buying and selling of kidneys, here there's lots of interesting questions about coercion, about exploitation, about justified paternalism, and about kind of the way in which the complicity of healthcare providers to be involved with that. So that's a very brief, encapsulated 10,000-foot attempt to kind of talk about what I found interesting in this field.
That's very helpful, thank you. So also towards the end of the book, you engage with this very difficult but very important ethical question as to what might be the relevant normative ethical baseline or standard by which we might evaluate some of these practices of medical tourism. So you look at consequentialist frameworks, you look at the idea of intrinsic corruption, you look at a free market approach. What do you think might be the most helpful normative ethical framework to make sense of these practices?
Great, yeah. So, one thing I would say is that maybe this might irk some philosophers, is I tend to be much more of a pluralist and also somewhat of an opportunist. I'm sure this is somewhat of my legal training, in that I want to make arguments that are convincing to people, but also hear seriously what they think. So very often I will examine multiple points of view from an ethical theory perspective on what the right answer ought to be, and then just trace the implications and push back on them. I think I have my priors about things. I tend to, start with kind of views about, what works well in an institutional context, and very sensitive to the context of kind of what has worked and what governments have done as kind of baselines. But I often, for example, so even though I'm not a particular believer in kind of the Elizabeth Anderson, Peggy Radin, Michael Sandel-ish line on the corruption as an objection to commodification, a form of the commodification objection, I try to take it seriously and then examine what the implications are. I would say I'm probably broadly consequentialist leaning, but with kind of robust theories of kind of rights as constraints here. So I'm not a thoroughgoing deontologist, but I'm also not completely opposed to that.
Okay, well, that's very helpful. Thank you. So I thought for our next question, we could talk about mitochondrial replacement therapy.
Sure.
You've done extensive work on this topic. There seems to be quite a bit of misunderstanding about what MRT is amongst the general public. It's sometimes colloquially referred to as three-parent IVF. So perhaps you could talk about, just exactly what is MRT, what are the most significant therapeutic benefits offered by MRT, and then finally, what are some of the most significant ethical questions raised by the clinical application of MRT?
Yeah, so first, why do we need it? So many women suffer from or will transmit what's known as mutant mitochondrial disease, and they have mutant mitochondria. So in particular, I think it's something like 1 in 15,000 women or 1,000 childbirths a year of children with these serious diseases, including something like Leigh's syndrome. The results for the children vary a little bit based on the kind of disease they have and severity, but they're pretty severe and they're pretty negative in terms of the life effects it has on these children. A mitochondrial replacement therapy, which was pioneered in the UK from the Newcastle group, is a set of technologies that seek to take one woman's nuclear DNA and combine it with the mitochondrial DNA from another woman, replacing kind of the diseased mitochondria from one woman with healthy ones, and then fertilize it with a sperm. And that's why it's often referred to as three-parent IVF, because there are actually 3 genetic parents. But why myself and many people don't like the name three-parent IVF is it seems to presuppose a lot of answers to what are difficult questions.
Right.
One of them is from a legal and social perspective, should the woman who gives mitochondrial DNA be considered a mother? What does being a mother mean? Can you be a mother in some senses but not others? And the use of the term three-parent IVF, which is quite colloquial and quite easier to understand, I think, kind of presupposes the answers to many of those questions. In reality, the mitochondrial DNA donor is giving very little of the total DNA, and what it expresses in terms of phenotypes, in terms of traits, is very little as well, if anything. Some are contested exactly how much, but very little. So the controversy is that I think, the UK, after 13 years of animal and preclinical testing, after robust public consultation, after debates in Parliament, finally empowered the HFEA, their regulatory authority, to engage in licensing for this for particular clinics for particular procedures. That was a major victory of an excellent, I think, process. In the United States, FDA kind of dragged its feet a little bit, eventually referred the matter after hearing many meetings to the national academies that generated an outstanding report, in my opinion, and one that recommended a limited pathway forward for mitochondrial replacement therapies, which would have limits to say only serious diseases. They recommended initially only male-only embryo selection, which is itself kind of controversial, to limit the transmission of mitochondrial alteration in the future, going forward. But this was a fairly good report, fairly detailed. From the time that FDA commissioned it, before the National Academies issued it, Congress actually passed an appropriations rider, which FDA has interpreted to prohibit MRT. I say has interpreted it because the language of the rider seems more clearly focused on preventing germline gene editing of the kind that has become a little bit more familiar with the events in Hong Kong, but has kind of swept MRT in its eddy. There are robust attempts to kind of get some changes afoot. We actually had a gathering at Petrie Flom relatively recently of some of the leading scientists, ethicists, policymakers, and the like, to see if we can potentially see some ways forward for changing it. But the result is that there are all these parents who would like to have genetically related children who cannot do so because it turns out that they will have a chance to pass on mitochondrial diseases that will manifest with severe harm to their children. And we're hopeful that there'll be a path forward that will allow them to use this technology to both have genetic parenthood, which of course is a contested goal, right? I have my skepticism about genetic essentialism somewhat, but it's something that the average person, you or I, would like to do, and most of us intend to have children that are genetically related to both parents. So it can enable them to do so while also enabling the children to be born healthy.
Okay, very good. Well, last night you gave a fascinating and very important lecture on the second reproductive revolution. I was wondering if you could perhaps elaborate a bit more on what the second reproductive revolution might hold for us going forward and some of those significant ethical concerns that might arise.
Yeah, so I'm working on a new book, which this is the working title. I'm sure the title will change a million times before it's done. It's hopefully aimed at more of a lay audience than this past book, which is a little more scholarly. But the goal is to really talk about 5 technologies, think about it as a group biography, if you will, of 5 technologies that have emerged in the last few years, relatively recently, and I think are changing the face of reproduction. One is elective egg freezing. So this is egg freezing for women for fertility preservation. One is uterus transplant, so transplanting either from a living donor or a cadaver to a woman, a uterus, to deal with uterine infertility and the inability to have a pregnancy. Potentially in the future one day for men too. Maybe we'll be able to have transplantation to men, so men can experience pregnancy. A third is mitochondrial replacement therapy, which we just talked about. A fourth is gene editing more broadly. And then the last one, which is one that most people are probably least familiar with, is called in vitro gametogenesis, which essentially will be taking adult cells, like our skin, for example, and causing them to revert to an earlier stage of their development and then coaxing them to become a sperm and egg. And we've done this in puppies, we've done this in mice, I think we may have even done it in primates now, including, very interestingly, deriving sperm from female adults. And I'll say that again because it's a strange thing to hear, but the idea that women could produce sperm. And so one of the big advantages are women who are past the reproductive age. We could generate a large number of eggs from them. The average woman, rather than having to go through egg retrieval and the hormonal effects and some of the risks of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, but also more, I think, far-reaching ideas like the possibility that 2 women could both be genetic mothers to a child, one of whom gives sperm and one of whom gives eggs, which I think is kind of a crazy thing to wrap your mind around.
It is.
So collectively, I think what's interesting is that these 5 technologies, as opposed to what I would characterize as the first revolution, IVF, pre-implantation, genetic diagnosis, and the like, those are mostly focused on, if you'll pardon the word, mimicking coital reproduction, enabling people with various kinds of diseases or other lack of opportunity to have what heterosexual coital reproduction produces. These 5 technologies I view as kind of focused not on mimicking, but on extending. The idea that we're going to reach a point where reproduction looks radically different, right? Whether it's the idea of men being pregnant, whether it's the idea of women freezing their eggs and only having their first child in their 50s, for example, whether it is the idea of that, I will produce 1,000 or 10,000 embryos from my skin cells, and then we will gene edit, or we will engage in PGD to select the best one. Whether it's the idea of unauthorized reproduction, possibly from those same skin cells, or this idea of multiple genetic parents, which many of these technologies facilitate. And the claim is that our existing legal infrastructure, social infrastructure, ethical infrastructure will be challenged by these technologies and have to rethink perhaps what it means to be a parent.
Absolutely, it's going to keep the bioethicists busy for quite a while.
That's my hope, is let's say one of the things I love about our business is that the scientists that keep me busy keep the other bioethicists busy. So we should be very thankful for them for the innovation they do for human beings and for human health is wonderful too, don't get me wrong. But from my perspective, the narrow intellectual thing, it gives me something to write about just about every day of my life.
Absolutely. So another related technology that you've written about in a very fascinating, provocative way involves artificial wombs. So you've argued that this may radically transform the abortion debate in this country. I wonder if you could speak about what's the current state of the science today in 2019, and how might artificial wombs transform this entire discussion? Yeah,
so the most well-noted artificial womb was used for premature newborn, I believe it was lambs, out of CHOP in Philadelphia. And they were talking about transferring early from the womb into the sustaining technology. My mother refers to it as the baby in the bag, because I once showed her a diagram of this showing it, but this basically a way of kind of sustaining outside of the wombs. So far, there is no proof that it has been done or can be done for embryos at the beginning of pregnancy, at the very beginning, and really this is kind of being used so far for mitigation of extreme prematurity. But as bioethicists ought to do, we ought to think about the future and future extensions of the technology. And one of those extensions would be the idea of complete ectogenesis, the idea of having basically sustenance completely outside of the womb. So the idea that we could have artificial wombs from the very beginning, so IVF into an artificial womb, or maybe even a couple of weeks into pregnancy, somewhere earlier. And so I'm very interested in the way in which the development of this technology might change the debate about abortion, both as a legal and an ethical matter. First, as an ethical matter, I think the most persuasive abortion rights kinds of arguments that have been marshaled follow along the Judith Jarvis Thompson kind of line and are really about rights not to gestate or to stop gestating. Right. Well, one thing that ectogenesis might do might be to realize a world where one could abort in the sense of stop gestating without terminating the fetus, such that it now calls upon the question about whether the abortion right is best understood as a right to stop gestating or as a right to terminate the fetus apart from gestation. And once framed as such, one begins to see how claims about gender inequality, which have been at the root of why, for example, there's an old case, I think it's Missouri v. Danforth, where the state of Missouri gave paternal veto to abortion. And the Supreme Court says you can't do that, even though both parents, the one who wants, the father who wants the pregnancy to continue and the woman who doesn't, have strong interests in this debate. Only the woman, because she is the one who gestates, wins, they say, in terms of making the decision. Well, now all of a sudden we've removed that out of the picture, and one wonders whether the debate about abortion should look more like embryo disposition disputes, which I've also written about, where you have frozen embryos and both sides kind of cannot reach an impasse upon divorce or sometimes upon death. And so I'm very interested both ethically and legally whether ectogenesis would mean the end of an abortion right if abortion is understood as a right to stop gestating rather than a right to terminate the fetus, and whether you can justify a right to terminate the fetus. And there's lots of interesting questions here, including about the Supreme Court's definition of when the state's interest becomes strong in the abortion context, which they have tied to viability. And now you might say, in a world of ectogenesis, is viability really as soon as you can do a transfer? Or do you have a right against a surgical kind of intervention if that's necessary for the transfer? Does it depend whether the transfer could be like Star Trek, like beaming the fetus out versus an incision, right? So I think it's just very interesting. But just to be clear, because the folks at CHOP got upset at me because when they read me as kind of pushing their science more than they are, I'm not. I'm an open-minded bioethicist, and I like to think about the future. But just to be clear, the future is not there yet, and they are particularly interested in kind of rescuing severely premature newborns, but there may come a time when the technology lets us do more.
Very good. Well, two other related technologies you mentioned earlier. You mentioned PGD and gene editing.
Yep.
I'm curious about your views on procreative beneficence, right? So this is an idea that's been defended by Julian Savulescu, the idea that we have a moral duty to produce the child with the best opportunity of the best life. I'm curious about your views on procreative beneficence. Is there a duty of procreative beneficence, and what might happen when that collides with reproductive freedom?
Great. So yeah, I've written quite a bit about this, and I have views that are complicated, so I'll try to kind of reduce them to something a little bit more manageable the following way. So I follow Parfitt, Brock, and a bunch of other people in being a believer in the non-identity problem. That is, I don't believe if the only way in which an entity can come into existence is by a particular act, I don't think you can say that it has been harmed by the act that brought it into existence. But, and I think this is kind of sometimes missed. Julian Savulescu is a very smart guy. I'm sure he doesn't completely miss it, but sometimes maybe downplayed, is the idea that what works for harm also works for benefit. That is to say, if in the process of selection, to use the simplest case, if it's a claim that we should select the best embryo, that can't be a claim that it benefits the embryo to be selected, because but for the selection of it, right, it would not come into existence, or but for the selection at least of the sperm and an egg to produce the best embryo, to produce the best person. So claims about procreative beneficence, I think, are often most intuitive when they're thought about as conferring benefit on an entity, when in fact, if you accept that you cannot harm an entity by these choices, logically it follows you cannot be said to bring benefit to them either. So that I think the whole language of harm and benefit is a bit of a red herring here. Instead, if you're going to justify it, it has to be justified on something like non-person affecting principle approaches, which says that the world is impersonally better if this child exists rather than another. That is a claim about replacement. It would be better for the world if we replace X with Y. And that, I think, is a less at least intuitively kind of desirable desiderata, if you'll pardon the alliteration there, for this, right? Is to say, we very much want to have make children happy. It's unclear whether we want to have happy children, right? Like, it's a different kind of claim. Now, it can be defended, and I think there's some interesting work, but you run into some interesting problems, especially when you're talking about different number cases. So I actually think the most cogent way of talking about beneficence and also avoidance of harm actually is in terms of externalities, is to sound like economists, which is to say that particular reproductive acts, like other kinds of acts, produce positive and negative externalities. Just as, you know, my liberty of my fist ends at the liberty you have in your face, why should that be different for reproduction? But yet we have this very, I think, common pre-theoretical intuition that our rights of reproduction are something where we don't typically think about the externalities we cause, positive or negative. And, you know, I want to push on that and challenge that a little bit. And I want to force the people who speak about procreative beneficence, just as people speak about procreative harms, to stop using the language of harm and benefit to an entity, to a particular entity, but instead defend their views on the grounds of either non-person affecting principles or externalities, or move to this more deontological kind of view that I associate with Elizabeth Harman or Shauna Schifrin. And I've written about, in each of these cases, I think there are some interesting problems that may be hard to overcome. But I would just be happy if people stop talking about this, about harm and benefit, and kind of recognizing Parfitt's point, which incidentally lies behind the law. In the United States, we have rejected wrongful life tort liability for the reasons, without referencing Parfitt or thinking about it in philosophical terms, that track Parfitt perfectly.
I think the notion of harm, too, is very complex and very rich as well, and how that relates to the legal notion of injury, how that relates to the idea of moral wrongness, how that relates to, should we conceive of harm as a setback to interest, should we conceive of that in terms of desire satisfaction theory. I think there's a lot of work to be done there in terms of fleshing out exactly what harm means, to give a conceptual analysis of harm.
Completely agree.
So one final question here. You've edited a recent major collection on health and big data, and how this is radically disrupting the healthcare system, how it may continue to disrupt the healthcare system going forward. Perhaps you could speak a bit about some of the most significant ethical issues that are going to be raised by the use of health big data. And finally, will it be possible to hold on to any kind of meaningful sense of privacy in an age of health big data?
That's a great question. So yeah, so we have this book from Cambridge University Press. We also have an ongoing project called Precision Medicine, AI, and the Law, or PMAIL for short, which emanates from a grant from the Novo Nordisk Foundation through the University of Copenhagen. And we've done some great publications in Nature Medicine and other places, JAMA, the usual places. So in terms of what I think the big issues are, right? So my mind's eye, when I imagine that I want to implement, in particular, artificial intelligence for healthcare, which is a big value proposition. By the way, most of the time is focused very heavily on the cutting edge and improving what we do already well. I'm blessed to live in Boston. Huge number of specialists and subspecialists, very high quality of academic medicine, quite expensive, by the way, for the system. One of the biggest benefits is not actually in improving what we already do well, but will be democratizing the expertise. So the average person doesn't have access to a dermatologist on a quick basis, especially if it's somebody in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, and the like. The idea that we could at least triage or partially replace or partially export some of the expertise of the outstanding dermatologist I would see here in the Harvard system to an app that could be accessed by people with a simple smartphone and a photo. That to me is the big proposition for doing good for the world. But imagine you're trying to build one of these either to do what we already do even better or to democratize expertise. There are a series of phases and challenges you face. First one is just where you get the data and what the conditions under which data may be used are. These days, many people's electronic health records are being used to build training data for artificial intelligence, and yet people have typically not explicitly consented. They might have implicitly done so or done so in some buried front door consent. And the question is whether that's good enough, whether it's good enough if we're able to strip them of the HIPAA identifiers. Is that enough? Should we have some more form of explicit consent? If we can't have consent, perhaps there are other ways of having patient decision-making involved, not at the individual patient level, but in a governance structure. So think about patients like a union or it being a trust where there's a trustee who speaks for, has fiduciary duties to those in the trust, for example. And then also what that data consists of, right? There are lots of under-inclusion. We see this in all kinds of big data uses, whether it's policing or healthcare. And that under-inclusion leads to inaccuracy as to particular subgroups. Sometimes it benefits the subgroups, but very often it does not. But in any case, it just means that we're going to have less accuracy. And this can be something like breast density in African American women than white women, for example, and whether our studies of whether it's likely to have something to be cancerous might be wrong for a subpopulation. So how do we think about that and how do we improve inclusion? That's all at the start when you're trying to get your data. Okay, you got your data now. Now the next thing is you want to build a model. And there's lots of interesting questions here. And here I think the law and the law of patents and trade secrecy kind of conflicts to some extent with the goal for transparency and auditing. You want a model that works well. You want to make sure the coefficients are well stated, that everything can be looked at by multiple people, that it can be tested, that it can be played with. But there are tensions with doing that and trying to develop a commercially viable product, especially when you cannot patent the underlying algorithm. Instead, you must rely on other forms of intellectual property rights like trade secrecy. So just how transparent are we going to force it to be? Who's going to do the looking? Is it going to be an agency like an FDA? Is it going to be instead third-party auditing? These are real problems. Okay, you get through that phase. You've got something you want to now test in real-world settings. What is going to be the rules about informed consent? Do you need to tell particular patients that you are using an AI to help partially, or maybe in some instances significantly help direct their care? What has to be said? Do you need explicit consent? Does it matter if the consent is for something that's also going to have a resource allocation function where there may be strategic reasons to opt in or opt out? If an adverse event does occur, who is legally responsible for it? How do we apportion liability between makers, insurers, hospital systems, and physicians? And then finally, once you get through all that, you've got something that works, it works great, wonderful. Now there's questions, I think, about dissemination and questions about equitable sharing of what you have. If a AI algorithm is based on the backs and the data of all these patients, but only a slice of them get to benefit it because it's being sold back to hospitals and only high resource settings use it, is that a moral problem, and one for which we ought to have some form of graduated licensing, for example? Okay, so that's the huge overview. Now let me drill down to the question you asked about privacy and big data. So here's what I would say to people. And I have a diagram in one of our papers about an iceberg, and it shows there's just a tiny tip above the waterline and a huge iceberg below. The tiny tip above the iceberg, in terms of making inferences about your health, is what's covered by the HIPAA statute of the United States. That is covered entities, that is personal health information. It's really doctor-patient and other kinds of interactions that are captured in electronic health records. A little bit broader than that, but it's mostly that. Below the waterline, not covered by health privacy laws in the United States, are things like social media, are things like your shopping habits, are things like Target, are things like your Fitbit, are things about what other people are saying. And the truth of the matter is we're heading into a future where many of the inferences I can make about your health will not be based just on the HIPAA protected stuff, but on all these other things. And currently the US we have pockets where we've restricted some downstream uses, for example, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, but we do not have an omnibus data privacy protection for all the other things. Europe has done something very different with the GDPR. I think they're probably right in terms of the scope of what they've covered, but probably that we're wrong to be custodian specific and sectoral specific, but I'm less sure they've done the right level of protection in terms of whether they're too restrictive or not restrictive enough. It's still early days, and we'll also see how it's implemented. But I would say in the future, I'll know more about your health, or as much about your health, from things other than your interactions with your physician and other healthcare workers than I do about them from those interactions. And that's just a widely different world than the one for which the HIPAA statute was written in 1996.
Okay, well that may be a good point to end on. So thank you so much, Glenn, for
My pleasure.
your time and all the important work that you're doing.
Thank you for having me.